Thanks so much, Chris. We're busy bringing the next set of panelists on board, but I think you've already got us in this just completed panel well started with some of the solutions, because clearly some of our panelists are part of that, as they described with the work that they're doing in their various institutions. We've got today for the final panel, as Chris suggested, a representation of individuals who are spanning the spectrum of private and university-based solutions, starting with Eileen Donoghue from Stanford, who's coming on with us, who's looking at also the digital space, like many of our colleagues who just wrapped up. And also people who are more engaged in either government institutions or have been engaged in government institutions and kind of thinking about some of the structures. We have Thomas Kent, who's now at Columbia University, but who has a long personal history in broadcasting, both as a journalist, but also someone who's in charge of one of the mainstays of our efforts to counter disinformation from the Cold War period, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And Thomas is also the author of a new released book, Striking Back, on overt and covert options to combat Russian disinformation, that also came out of much of this exercise to kind of figure out what happened in 2016. We're also thrilled to have Daniel Kimmage from the State Department, the Global Engagement Center, which was an entity that was set up initially to deal with counterterrorism and to some of the groups that had already taken over the information space on the internet, but were using this to drive up extremism and, in fact, incite people to violence. And the State Department adapted, and Daniel will tell us about this when we get to him, this effort to try to tackle the problems of disinformation and dealing with state actors, not just non-state actors. And we also have, and we're really delighted that she was able to join us today. Of course, the internet makes this possible to bridge the differences. Tia Kanninen from Helsinki. Tia is the head of the Center of Excellence looking at hybrid warfare or information warfare based in Helsinki. She is a long-time foreign policy practitioner with a deep background in international affairs, but the center in Helsinki is one of Europe's paramount institutions for tackling this issue of disinformation. Eileen, you've just joined us, and I'm also very grateful to you and everybody who preceded us who've come in from Stanford. It's been an early morning for everyone. And Eileen, you've been doing a lot of pioneering work in the digital space, drawing on your own experience as an ambassador and as a government official, and many of the other things that you've done in the past, to try to get everyone to think about how internet platforms and the digital sector can do more themselves on this front. You're the bridge really from the second panel into this panel, from the kind of private sector into the public sphere as well. And you wrote an op-ed quite recently for The Hill on the pivotal role that internet platforms play in both protecting free speech, but also democracy. It's kind of digital responses and what the platforms can do to actually tackle these problems of disinformation. I wonder if you could just share with everyone what it is that you've been working on, thinking about, and then we'll move on to the other panelists. And we've got obviously a lot of questions related to this, as Chris already said, about what can the digital sector do, what can we do to counteract some of the problems of disinformation on social media. As Kate and Renee and others were saying, we're kind of doing this to ourselves. So Eileen, what are some of the tools that we can use?
Well, first, thank you so much for including me. It has been a fascinating conversation, and I've been a little stunned at the coherence and convergence of views. I did not anticipate that when I actually read the agenda. And yet I think we are all moving in the same direction. And in particular, I would underscore the starting place with General McMaster. on, the two big ideas I got from him is that we do need to demonstrate competence in combating these information operations, foreign intervention, coordinated inauthentic behavior, which I think we're actually doing a much better job on. And I would underscore the work of civil society and academic researchers. And Renee DiResta, Kate Starbird, the best and the brightest have literally flooded to this zone, and they kind of have us covered in that diagnostic space. I would also say the private sector has done much better from day one after the election, when Mark Zuckerberg said, "Oh, you're all crazy if you think we had an effect on this election." And I remember talking to a couple folks from Facebook, policy folks at a conference right after the election, saying, you guys are crazy. This was won on the margin. Everybody knows that. And how you can't see it was just so stunning to me. I have no diagnostic background, and I could tell you, we haven't been able to prove causality exactly in a social scientific way necessarily, but it was patently obvious that it had an effect on civic discourse around the election. Similarly, on the government front, obviously, a lot of people have talked about the extent to which we were caught off guard, the national security community thinking about, the hard infrastructure, not anticipating the potential potency of information as a weapon around an election. So, we've made a lot of progress there. But the second point of from General McMaster is the part I would emphasize is the real part we need to work on, which is the culture, the domestic side of the equation that you've been underscoring. We lack unity, and we lack confidence in who we are as a people, and we really need to be. I would say we almost need to take. I'm glad everybody's working on the diagnostic side, the foreign side, the platform side, but the real work ahead is on the domestic political culture, and I would say mainstream media less than social media. That said, I will actually answer your question and say the two things that I think that could be done with respect to the private sector or social media side. In terms of government regulation, rather than doing what we've seen in Europe, which I think is a big mistake, and focusing on regulating on a content basis, and in fact, shifting liability to the private sector platforms for user-generated speech, which will lead them to actually squelch free expression. Also shifting judicial function to the private sector for assessing criminality. I would not recommend that in the United States. In the United States, if we can get past our political dysfunction, I would say focus on transparency and accountability. That is actually the first step for us in understanding what it really means to be living and working and engaging in algorithmically driven information environments. And obviously, we need more transparency for users around the rules. That's one level. We need more transparency for governments to assess whether platforms are doing what they've promised in terms of executing on their rules, but also transparency with respect to the decision rules baked into the algorithms and how they further the deterioration of civic discourse. Last piece here is, on the private sector side, I think they have fundamentally misunderstood the meaning of free expression on their own platforms. And that there really are three different dimensions to free expression. One is the right to speak, which they get, and that's what they've been trying to protect, users' speech. That's great. But users also have a right to seek and receive information, and the quality of that information really matters. And part of free expression is expressing the democratic will of the people. And if the quality of civic discourse has deteriorated so much on these platforms that we undermine the real free expression to say, who do you want as your political leaders and what do you want as the outcome of your election, that is not protecting free expression. And so I have emphasized their own free expression and their ability to say, no, we are choosing democracy. We are choosing higher quality information over lower quality information. That is not censorship. That is a manifestation of their own speech and their own values, and they should embrace it even more.
That's great, Eileen. And actually, that provides a very good segue into turning over to Thomas Kent, because one of the purposes of setting up Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Voice of America back during the Cold War was to actually counter disinformation with quality information. It wasn't just designed to be a propaganda outlet. And, you know, we've been grappling with how to tackle this in these ways that you've even described about transparency and accountability since the Cold War, when we were obviously in a very different space that wasn't digital and wasn't so individually consumer driven. And Tom, I know that you've been, thinking about this for some time. I mean, you were a journalist for many years, teaching at Columbia, teaching journalists and other students. And you've just written this book about how to tackle it, some of it looking at the old style methods, both overt and covert. But as we hear what Eileen has had to say, what are you thinking about as you move forward from analysing this issue and thinking about, what to tell your students and other people who are listening in today?
Right. Well, good afternoon, Fiona. And for some reason, my camera's a little fuzzy today. I apologize. I would like to, let me start with a point that you made, Fiona, and I think it was an interview in July with the Wilson Center. You emphasized the importance of stabilizing the U.S. relationship with Russia, moving it beyond the current framework of geopolitical competition, with the hope of regaining the ability that the U.S. and Russia had, even in the Cold War, to work jointly on challenges that both countries faced. To me, one thing that made Cold War cooperation possible was the relative military balance of power between Washington and Moscow. Stability there created a mutual sense of safety, or at least a mutual sense of terror, that created space for the two countries to move forward on other things. Today, for all the reasons we've been discussing, we lack stability. And one reason is the information domain, the perception that Russia is assaulting democratic societies with disinformation, while Western countries do very little in response. If Russia feels it really has found in information a magic bullet to advance its goals, there's no reason for it not to continue to press that advantage to the further detriment of the political climate. But if we learn to respond more effectively, there could be something of a balance of information power, like a military balance that could create what the Russians might call the objective conditions to once again cooperate on the kinds of issues facing humanity that you outlined. I think it very much overstates things to say the West is inert in the information conflict. It's true that democratic governments aren't built to propagandize their own people or block their access to information. That's why in Western countries we do license Russia to have broadcasting operations, and we don't indoctrinate our children to believe everything that our governments say. But in many parts of the world, the West has not been idle. Some Western governments, especially in the Nordic and Baltic regions, have extensive programs to inoculate citizens against Russian information operations. Democratic governments and foundations are supporting a growing number of pro-democracy, non-government actors in Europe, Latin America, Africa, Asia, who are quite active in the information conflict. Some of these groups focus on the positive values of decent government and informed voting. Others actively expose disinformation and local corruption. Some urge businesses to stop advertising on conspiracy sites. A few have developed tools to identify disinformation networks, and then they work with the platforms to try to get those networks taken down. There's also an increasingly transnational group of independent journalists and fact checkers, some supporting democratic values and clean government in general, and some very much focused on Kremlin activity. Western countries also run international broadcasting in more than 60 languages, the BBC, Deutsche Welle, France's RFI, and of course the Voice of America and the other US networks like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, where I worked. As we know, the US networks are currently in substantial turmoil over political issues, but their audiences remain very significant. I've proposed that there be a closer relationship between these broadcasters and local pro-democracy groups. Along with creating their own programming, it seems to me these networks could also serve as production houses and distribution outlets for local organizations that often lack skills and visibility. There's also the question of covert information action. This is standard procedure, of course, for Russia: unattributed websites, false persona on social networks, bots to amplify messaging. Facing these tactics, some feel that we are fighting with one hand behind our backs if we don't adopt some of these tactics ourselves. Others very strongly resist this on both ethical and practical grounds. They say that's not who we are, but unquestionably, it is who we've been. Accounts of US and British covert action in the Cold War and since suggest how capable and far-reaching Western information operations were and conceivably could be again. The question is, how existential a threat do we or don't we consider Russian information operations to be? And if they are existential, which less transparent means to fight them might we undertake, and which remain totally out of bounds? Maybe we would never do disinformation, but is using bots to rapidly spread true information something that's utterly morally beyond the pale? In the conversation these days about responding to Russian information tactics, it's been rare for anyone to discuss the covert side. It's sensitive, obviously, but I think there should probably be more discussion of the subject. Government, for one reason, government and non-government actors charged with repelling hostile information are entitled to know, at least in broad outlines, what their societies consider fair and ethical and what they demand in this domain. I guess I covered a lot of ground here. Let me stop then, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Tom. There's actually one very specific question that looks like it was, well designed for you here that I'll ask you to respond before we go on. A lot of people are wondering whether, in light of, what you've just said about the information and, kind of media landscape and, your previous position, do we need some kind of legislation or special accreditation process for the free media in order to counter some of the disinformation as much as possible? I mean, that's kind of in a way, tying into, some of the things that Eileen, talked about. I mean, some of the risks of what the Europeans have done that, could actually stifle, free speech, by pushing liabilities onto private platforms, or the judicial response that Eileen spoke about as well. I mean, we already have media accreditation, and, you're at the School of Journalism, you've been a journalist. I mean, what do you think about this idea of going much further? I mean, it's almost be kind of creating a kind of a sort of an official list of who's a journalist and who isn't, which seems kind of difficult to put in place when you have an internet that's allowing all kinds of people to be bloggers and in effect, act as purveyors of information, not just participants in propaganda and manipulation, as some of our colleagues in the last panel said. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it bothers me a little bit, any idea of creating gold star journalists, officially recognized entities. I think it just either, Russia Today will be the first to sign up and, say, well, we've got a code of ethics too, and, you're discriminating against us, or the world will sort of line up as to, the gold star journalists, who are they stalking horses for? It's sort of like, I mean, they tried to do this on Twitter with these blue dots of verification, but how's that worked out for us? So I'm not that optimistic about how that might work.
These are all good points, because sometimes, as you and Eileen are saying, and as our colleagues in the last panel said as well, you create new instruments and regulations to solve a problem, then in effect start to create other ones that you hadn't necessarily foreseen. Now, I'll turn over to Daniel, because your organization, the Global Engagement Center, which you've been one of the pioneering people behind, started off doing something else, and was then, given what happened in 2016, was retrofitted or adapted, taking on this idea of the ecosystem to dealing with this new challenges. Perhaps you could tell us really about how you see instruments like the Global Engagement Center, based at the State Department, operating, and some of the things that you've learned by looking at other actors that are useful for this conversation. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you to everyone who's tuning into our panel today. As Fiona noted, Congress expanded the mission of the Global Engagement Center to fill a critical gap, which is the need to expose and counter disinformation from our foreign adversaries and competitors overseas. More specifically, the GEC's mission is to lead and coordinate efforts of the U.S. government to counter foreign disinformation aimed at undermining the stability of the United States, our allies, and our partners. And let me stress really that last word, partners. Renee DeResta on the previous panel talked about stakeholder collaboration, and that's absolutely central to our work, as will be evident from the overview that I give. We work with bureaus at the State Department and our embassies and our partners in the interagency and worldwide to build technical skills of civil society organizations, local influencers, and journalists to expose and counter disinformation that may be used to undermine the democratic process. We're developing partnerships with key local messengers who have the reach and the resonance to target audiences worldwide, and we're deploying technology to help to provide early indicators and warnings for disinformation. We're building international networks and strengthening the technical skills of civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, journalists, and other local actors, the people who are really best positioned to shine a light on the malign influence operations from Russia and China. I'm pleased to say that we're seeing strong growth in the GEC's resource base. In fiscal year 2016, the base budget was around $20 million. By fiscal year 2019, it was about $55 million. In fiscal year 20, it was nearly $65 million. In the fiscal year 21 request is for $138 million to match this growing challenge of countering foreign propaganda and disinformation. So let me say a few words about Russia, which spreads disinformation with the goal of dividing societies and having citizens lose trust in democracy and democratic institutions. The disruption of society is Russia's main goal. Increasing their prestige on the world stage is a distant secondary aim. They are really trying more to create disorder and break down existing order rather than build anything up. Russia employs a collection of official, proxy, and unattributed communication channels and platforms to create and amplify disinformation and propaganda. We recently detailed this in our report, Russian Pillars of Disinformation and Propaganda, showing how this ecosystem functions as a collection of official, unofficial, proxy, and unattributed channels that they use to amplify false narratives. We showed, and I would encourage everyone to just search for the report. You can find it on the State Department website. This ecosystem has 5 pillars. There are official government communications. State-funded global messaging is the second pillar. Third is the cultivation of proxy sources, many of them hidden. Fourth is the weaponization of social media. And fifth is cyber-enabled disinformation. The Kremlin invests massively in this. Its intelligence services and proxies conduct malicious cyber activity to support their disinformation efforts. And then it leverages outfits that masquerade as news sites or research institutions to spread false and misleading narratives. I encourage you to read the report, which, as I said, you can find on the State Department's website. In short, the Kremlin tries to disrupt the current world order in order to accomplish its goals. So what are we doing about it? So the Global Engagement Center works to expose what Russia is doing with things like the report that we just released. We recognize that sunlight is the best disinfectant in this case. We work closely with our partners in the Bureau of European Affairs, our partners at U.S. European Command, and others on coordinated lines of effort to counter Russian disinformation. We are also partnering with select European countries to establish an operational working group that shares insights on Russian disinformation tactics and coordinates on countermeasures. We've also kicked off some very concrete initiatives. For example, a 2-year project to build resistance to disinformation in the most vulnerable European societies by increasing direct person-to-person engagement on this issue. We're working with our State Department colleagues to find and quickly fund projects with local organizations on the front lines of countering COVID disinformation in Africa, South America, and Europe. We also support civil society groups in Central and Eastern Europe that build resiliency in their local communities, running joint communications campaigns with allies to counter Russian historical revisionism and to empower fact checkers in Latin America to stem the surge of Russian disinformation in that region. A good example of the synthesis of multiple lines of effort came last fall when we worked with our colleagues in the UK and in the Baltic states on a joint campaign to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Baltic Way, a milestone on the road to the breakup of the Soviet Union. We knew that the Kremlin was attempting to rewrite history of this occasion, and we worked with our partners to ensure that the truth was heard. And the GAC's ability to coordinate campaigns like this helps to counter Russian propaganda and present a unified front with our allies. Lastly, a couple of words on our broad approach, which is really to, as I said, work with partners and allies, but also to utilize all the latest tools at our disposal. So for example, we make very active use of data analytics to provide early warnings of foreign disinformation to allies and partners. We analyze the attempts by our adversaries to target vulnerable foreign audiences, and we share our information with stakeholders. We look to build the technical skills of civil society organizations, NGOs, journalists, and other local actors who are best positioned to expose and counter the spread of disinformation. And we use our own domestic platforms and our diplomatic missions abroad to share fact-based and historically accurate information. I would note that our legislation specifically tasks us with circulating and promoting fact-based narratives. Lastly, just the final point, of course, a well-informed citizenry is key to the strength of any democratic institution and to building resilience to adversarial disinformation. Ultimately, countering foreign propaganda and disinformation is a long-term effort that requires working with international partner governments and organizations to build societal resilience and reduce vulnerabilities to malign propaganda and disinformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I just want to actually put a quick question to you, which again seems quite directed in the area that you've been working on. I mean, one of our audience was wondering, and given the fact that you yourself used to work on terrorism, and kind of obviously terrorists and all kinds of other non-state actors use the same tools as states do, and we've seen that the Russian state has used proxies and cutouts, hiring hackers and all kinds of others, so that when Putin says the Russian state doesn't do this, or his press spokesman recently, they have what we referred to before as a kind of implausible, but still plausible deniability here. I mean, you and others who've been tracking this can see the indicators that, this is a state-sponsored action, but by not using state agents, but proxies, there is, kind of different layers here. So people are wondering if you in your work and on the work you've done before can see evidence of formal relationships or proxy relationships between things like white supremacist groups and other extremists, I could say a left and right in the US domestic circles and foreign actors.
Well, let me start with a caveat that comes from our legislation and our authorities and where we are, which is that we're directed by our legislation to look at propaganda directed at foreign audiences. So we don't look at the US domestic environment. We do have colleagues, of course, in the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force, in DHS, who do look at that, but we look at propaganda directed at audiences abroad because that's what our legislation tells us to do. Now, I will say in terms of Russian disinformation and propaganda, they have a long and well-documented history of leveraging extremes, leveraging everything that can be divisive within society. So that's something we have seen them do. We've seen them do it in the European context and other places, and it's something I anticipate that they will continue to do.
So that being said, I mean, that raises another question about really, how to coordinate. You said about coordinating with partners on the foreign parts of disinformation, but when you get something, this is really kind of another set of questions here that you see in a foreign arena when you're working with your partners that has a domestic US or one of the, that really points in this direction, that you can see foreign actors manipulating groups that are acting within the United States. what do you do? I mean, how does that coordination take place? Because a lot of people in the audience are clearly concerned that we might not be coordinating in a way that would be relevant to the US domestic environment.
Sure. With the caveat that government coordination is one of these things that doesn't have an exciting visible component. It consists of emails and phone calls and meetings, but we are in close communication with our colleagues at DHS, with our colleagues at FBI. The Global Engagement Center has set up an interagency coordination cell. So we are in constant communication. So when we see something that has a nexus that would be appropriate for our domestic counterparts, we obviously pick up the phone or write an email, and we're in touch with them. But just to stress, the Global Engagement Center's mission is focused on audiences abroad.
Right, and that's a very important point, and we're going to go and talk to one of the partners in Europe. I know we were having some technical difficulties with Tia Tilikainen on the video side, but I think that she has been able to join us by phone from Helsinki. And Tia, I hope you were able to hear what everybody else was saying here. I mean, clearly, when the hybrid Centre of Excellence was set up in Helsinki, you had many of the issues that Daniel was just talking about in mind, about this foreign interference, all of these activities abroad by the Russians, other concerns about the non-state actors, and how to tackle this hybrid information space, not just the kind of physical space that we've been used to of warfare. And of course, the big impact this was also having on other European countries. So in listening to what everybody else has been talking about today, and given the work that you have done with Daniel and the Global Engagement Center and others, what do you think a US audience should be mindful of from a European perspective? Tia, are you still able to hear us? That's unfortunate. Hopefully we'll get Tia back again. But Daniel, you've worked with our counterparts. I mean, there's a centre in Helsinki that Tia represents and directs. There's also one in Riga, in Prague, Riga in Latvia, that is, in Prague in the Czech Republic. There are a lot of partners for you to work with. How does that cooperation work?
So I would actually flag this as one of the most exciting and productive aspects of our work. And it involves, obviously, some of the centers that you've just mentioned. It involves governments. But really, ideally, if you look at what we are trying to construct, it is this network of networks that brings together the efforts of government, the efforts of civil society, et cetera. So I brought together I brought in the example of the Baltic Way campaign to counter Russian historical revisionism. But I think there are increasing examples of cooperation at multiple levels. And to go back to what Renee was saying in the previous panel, it's such a complicated problem and it has so many components. Some of them are historical and cultural. Some of them may be regulatory. Some of them are technical. And that expertise is never going to be gathered in a single place under a single roof. We recognize that at the Global Engagement Center, we have a growing staff, but even so, we're never going to be absolutely expert in every single thing. The only way that we're going to have a chance here is to bring together and leverage sort of our collective capabilities. And just from the list that you've articulated, and there are many, many more now emerging, that you see this in the research community, I think that compared to where we were 3 years ago, 5 years ago, there's been a huge amount of progress. Obviously, there's more to be done, but this is, I think, one of the unsung victories in this early stage, this emergence and sort of efflorescence of partnerships.
That's great. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for filling in, because I think we have Tia now on the phone. Tia, if you can hear us, we'd like to hear a bit more about what you're doing at the Hybrid Centre of Excellence in Helsinki, and how you're tackling all these issues of disinformation from a European perspective.
Yes, hello, Fiona. I had some problems with my connection, but I hope I'll be able to be with you now. Many thanks for inviting me to this discussion. We have been working hard in Helsinki in our Center of Excellence on countering hybrid threats with these issues, and I haven't quite been able to listen to all of your discussion, but I will make a couple of points which when we talk about disinformation, also election interference, as we have been discussing a lot this morning. There are things that we want to stress from the point of view of our Center of Excellence, which is, of course, a joint effort of EU and NATO members to tackle this hybrid threat in its entirety, including disinformation. So from our point of view, disinformation is and has to be seen as a part of hybrid threat operations and campaigns. So it is one of those instruments, being used in a concerted manner against our democratic societies. So also the responses and policy instruments must be such that they can tackle the whole set of instruments. We talk about different stages of hybrid threats and usually divide them into the priming phase and then the operational phase. And it is exactly in this priming phase where we see disinformation used against societies. It is paving the way for a later operation. It is sowing discord in the society, weakening the trust of government, and so it needs to be seen as the first step, and then of course the final goal being at a later state to exert power and steer decision making of a democratic society in a more comprehensive manner. So in our center, we have been trying to monitor, make these threats visible, but also asking ourselves, how do we counter this phenomenon of hybrid threats and disinformation as a part of it? So we have been developing some tools that we have been then putting in the form of recommendations to our participating states, currently 28. We talk about deterrence and ask ourselves, how do we deter these phenomena that are not traditional threats? How do we create resilience against those? And these are, I think, questions that we all should tackle together and ask ourselves, how can we deter in an environment where the threats are non-traditional? Questions that we have raised together with our partners, our participating states. How do we deny the benefits of disinformation from the adversaries? How do we increase the costs of these campaigns? And these solutions are not easy to find. We can say that attribution is an important tool when we want to raise the costs or deny the benefits. We can say that collective responses, something that we can do all together in the EU-NATO context, are always better than if we have to go to state-by-state responses. We have to show that these threats to the adversaries are not as cost efficient as they are believed. And finally, I would also like to stress the role of building resilience. So we both deter and build resilience. And here we have a couple of tools that I would like to mention where we have been pointing out and discussing together with our networks and participating states. We need to improve our situational awareness. It's the key among decision makers in an environment where different types of hybrid tools are being used and this information becomes more and more common. So we must ensure, as we have been hearing this morning, how healthy media environment is important as a tool here. Independent fact-based reporting, journalistic media to be safeguarded as its role is vital in this context, but also more broader in the society, the societal media literature developed. We heard in the previous panel a lot about cooperation with social media platforms, and of course this is an important tool in building resilience in our our societies and preventing hybrid threats and countering them. So this is what I would like to say. We need cooperation, we need our networks, and our Center of Excellence is a network-based organization, so we try to share good practices, talk to each other, and act as collectively or together as possible in front of this new phenomenon. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you so much for this. I mean, I'd like to use what you just said on social media resilience as a segue back to Eileen again, because I mean, Eileen, I think, you know, part of the issue and many of the questions are, you know, directed at this about, you know, is it possible to get, and you were adding cautions about how we should approach social media regulation. Is it possible to get social networks to private companies, platforms, to work together in the same way that TIR is discussing about countries and institutions like NATO and the EU to be able to tackle this problem as well? I mean, is that an appropriate way of working on this? I mean, obviously, we've heard through the other panels, we heard from John McMaster, the private cyber companies. Thomas Rid talked about Kaspersky, a Russian cyber company that actually helped him unearth a lot of information about the active measures. But they also talked about FireEye and, you know, those. We know that cybersecurity companies have been very active. But what about the social media platforms? We hear a lot about Twitter and Facebook doing things individually. You talked about this. What are your thoughts on this?
So mine?
No, Tia, actually, Eileen.
Yeah,
but I think Eileen still, and then I'll come back to you again. Yeah, thanks, Tia. Thank you.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Great. So two things occur to me. The first of which is what I emphasized earlier, is that the platforms themselves have to make their own choices and, you know, declare what their values are and be a little bit more straightforward about what their algorithms are promoting and demoting, and what they are choosing to emphasize and de-emphasize, which is an aspect of their free expression. But I would say they need to do a little better job of putting a stake in the ground and helping the culture on their platforms move in the right direction by choosing higher quality and you know, truthful information, et cetera. Doesn't mean that they squelch the voices of politicians they don't like. That's not what I'm talking about. But I do think that there is a way to be more proactive about disinformation than they are. They're slowly moving in that direction as they talk about, you know, real world harm. They're starting to see that, you know, real disinformation about COVID counts as real world harm. And I think the same could be said about disinformation around elections counts as real world harm. If you literally go to the point, not only at the administration of election, but if you are dissuading voters, that is eroding something that's very valuable to the society. That's the first thing. On the coordination piece, I do believe the platforms are moving in that direction. There are some concerns coming from civil society about that, or even sort of, first of all, we don't want homogeneity necessarily. We don't want the platforms to all have the same rules and the same personalities. And in fact, there is another initiative that is called the GIF-CT, Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. It's an experiment that is, an organization formed by several platforms. They are now moving in a multi-stakeholder direction, you know, cross-sector working groups on a variety of different issues to combat the threat of terrorism online. And it really got energized post Christchurch, where people came to see that we really do need global cooperation, cross-platform cooperation, cross-sector cooperation. There's discussion about doing the same thing in the disinformation realm, but disinformation is even a tougher conceptual category to get your head around than terrorism. Terrorism content is hard enough to define. Disinformation is even harder for all the reasons we've discussed, especially because it's now, you know, the domestic dimensions of it certainly move you into free expression concerns. But directionally, yes, there should be more cooperation and coordination there.
No, that's great. And obviously there are, some parallels that terrorists, like extremist groups, often use the same tools and the same methods in their approach. And terrorists are also, obviously, in many cases, spreading disinformation. So I can see that that might be one method. I think, it's obviously a very interesting development. And in a way, probably the Global Engagement Center was coming from the same kinds of ideas, right, Daniel, as this kind of GIF, as this kind of global internet or information forum. Tom, if you could just give us a little bit of thoughts on the whole, world of international broadcasting, because that's content and, and kind of information that's not supposed to be disinformation. But as you alluded to, and I think as many people tuning in here know, it's a very controversial issue at the moment. Should things like Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty be the same as they were in the Cold War? Should they actually become more active arms of propaganda? Should they be more political? How can we think about the kind of the state overseen media space as opposed to the private media space in this context?
Well, of course, from the Russian standpoint, they were propaganda and they are propaganda. And if you look at the amount of coverage, for example, that U.S. international broadcasters have given to the Navalny case or to what's going on in Belarus, it certainly looks to the Russians as if what they do is to harp on these specific issues that are so sensitive from the Russian standpoint. So you'll never convince the Russians they're not propaganda. And from our standpoint, it seems to me that they need to do two things. On the one hand, certainly fair, accurate news is absolutely critical. That's the core of it, and that's what some of the current stress is about, some of the political pressure that's being put on the broadcasters. On the other hand, I don't think it's immoral to say that for $800 million a year, U.S. taxpayers are entitled to broadcasting networks that do their best to emphasize what there is good about the United States, about democracy, about the EU, and so forth. So that's an important mission as well. If you look at, for example, coronavirus, is it propaganda? Would it be propaganda for the Voice of America, for example, to have every day on their homepage a rubric column about what the U.S. is doing to fight coronavirus overseas? Everybody knows that the U.S. pulled out or is in the process of pulling out of the World Health Organization. But what about, all the embassies around the world and all the private U.S. charities that in various ways are very active in this cause? If the VOA made a point of this every day on page one, would that be propaganda? Is that something the State Department should be doing, not VOA, not breaking news, or is it completely illogical? So I think in this issue of U.S. international broadcasting, at least, there are really two issues. One is the question of independence and political pressure, where I come down very strongly on the side of the broadcasters. At the same time, I think Congress really needs to decide, and it hasn't decided. It sort of plays both sides in the governing legislation about what it wants these broadcasters to be.
I think that's a very good point, because I think what we're all talking about of these several panels is how certainly our adversaries are pointing to our divisions rather than what has actually in fact united us. And the Voice of America could easily be the voice of Americans who are not state actors, but are actually, doing very positive things. And there could be a lot more attention paid to the things that are actually working in America, as opposed to the things that are not working. In fact, I recall when I was at the National Security Council, a discussion with one of our ambassadors, our ambassador to Austria, for example, who'd done a lot of research. He came out of a public relations background, who was bemoaning the fact that, we'd lost that public information, public diplomacy, aspect of some of our State Department efforts. It was all there, but it wasn't getting as much attention as it was in the past. and that where populations in, places like Austria and elsewhere had used to have a very positive view of the United States based on the activities of everything from cultural exchanges and civic exchanges and all the things that they knew, artists and other things that Americans were doing. Now all they heard about was the bad news coming out of America. And this was obviously having a pretty negative effect on our international standing. So there is very much obviously something to what you're saying there.
Right, and to be sure, Voice of America does continue to report positive news about the United States. I guess the real question, though, is that when you have international audiences who are saying on CNN and Fox, which is distributed to some degree internationally, nonstop America in chaos, country falling apart, does U.S. international broadcasting have some obligation to affirmatively try to balance that or not? Are they just independent journalists and they'll do what they'll do?
I think that's a very important debate that we should be having, particularly in the context of, the eyes of the world being on us in our election, and obviously the relentless drumbeat of seemingly kind of bad news that's coming out of here. I mean, I wonder, Tia, as you're listening to this, from the vantage point of Helsinki, I mean, how has the centre and kind of NATO and EU grappled with this question about how you also handle countering disinformation with information? And, obviously, you have to counter in some ways a lot of the divisive commentary about the actions of NATO and EU and individual countries as well. And I know that in Finland, you've been no stranger to these information operations that have been trying to put Finland in a rather negative light as well by Russia.
Yeah, this is really a tricky question. I think Russia and all the other adversaries are using efficiently every possibility to show that the European Union or the transatlantic community is not united. So we should really keep this in mind and not let the minor disagreements dominate our public image. We should, as you said, Fiona, be much more efficient with providing the good news and stress our unity, as there is a lot of that as well. In Finland, this is a well-known phenomenon to us, disinformation, and it is these tools that I mentioned. First of all, the whole of government approach to disinformation and all hybrid threats. We need to cooperate with the private sector actors, with these media actors. We need to develop our media literacy in the society. But more and more also, and this is the message from my center, this is not something any nation can do alone. We must find the good practices, and we must find our authority to be communicated to the world. So we must dominate this information environment with our messages from the EU and the transatlantic community. Otherwise, someone else is doing it for us, and I think this is not so complicated. So strategic information, really strategic communication, is something we should all pay attention to, and not let the minor disputes dominate the global information agenda.
Thanks. I mean, Daniel, how are you tackling, you mentioned a lot about data sharing best practices, but what about this strategic communications dimension that Taya was talking about? How much is that factored into your current work?
Well, I mean, communications in the end are everything. It's important to remember that the Global Engagement Center is really here to facilitate and to galvanize. We're not the ones outside of very limited forums like this generally doing the communication. What we are doing is building that network of partners who are the right people, who are the right messengers with the understanding of the local context, with the credibility to actually bring the message to the right target audience. And that's going to look different in each context, in each setting. So the sort of secret sauce on our side is both kind of a variety of the very traditional work of diplomacy and building bridges, but also making sure that we can bring all the technical tools and the whiz-bang and the data science, et cetera. But in the end, it is a very almost face-to-face communications task. And that's going to happen through the partnerships once again, because that's absolutely key to success here.
Thanks, Daniel. I mean, obviously, this is a pretty multifaceted approach here. I apologize if there's noise in the background. Someone's actually mowing the lawn in my neighbour's yard. It's extremely loud, making my own strategic communications a little bit more difficult than normal here. Eileen, I mean, you've been in this space of communications and also diplomacy. You've been an ambassador. You know, I thought perhaps, you know, you might be able to help us wrap this up with a few, you know, parting thoughts for the audience at home, because each of us individually can be a strategic communicator about this problem, right? Because, you know, as everybody made it very clear on the second panel, we're all in this together. We're participating in this communication space. We are as much the communicators and the purveyors of information as anybody else is. And it's the content that we often produce that others are using. So Eileen, I mean, some final thoughts for us on, you know, how we can all do this better.
Yes. So first off, to the comments that were made, absolutely, Democratic Alliance needs to stress the unity between us, and we actually have to rebuild that unity. Second, whole of government approach. You know, it's almost a cliche. Yes, absolutely, that is true. I fear that we are doing the opposite. And I reflect, you know, several people have brought up Peter Pomerantsev's book, which I read right after 2016. I read it in December 2016, and Nothing is True, Everything is Possible. He did a remarkable job depicting the very nihilistic culture that was post-Soviet Russia, the media culture, the political culture. And I literally felt sick. And I felt like, oh my gosh, it would be sickening to live in a culture like that. And we were so different. No wonder we were caught off guard. My biggest fear is we have become a culture where nothing is true. And it is in the House, and it is in the culture, and it is in the political rhetoric. And so I hope we are not being caught off guard in terms of what happens post-election. We have to get through the election. I would emphasize mainstream media reporting on hacked docs material. Beware. Janine Zakaria, Andy Grotto, Stanford folks, fabulous guidance, 10 points on how the media should not be reporting on hacked material. Think about election night, election week, election month. It's going to be a long time, and we need to normalize the idea that we don't necessarily get the outcome immediately. And the media has to bring calm to help get us across this threshold. And then we can rebuild our culture, bring the public in, bring our allies back together.
These are very important messages, Eileen, and I'm glad that you were able to bring it back to the biggest issue at hand, which is the election, people having the confidence to go out there and vote, have trust in the people who are managing the elections at the local and state level, and knowing that we all have agency in that vote. And, you know, we have the ability to go out there and vote in many different forms, and that is also a key issue. So thank you very much for bringing that into the closing here, Eileen. I want to thank everybody for participating here. I hope that people get a chance to see Tom's book on dealing with this whole issue of disinformation from all kinds of different vantage points. I mean, Tom, with this long experience, the book is just now available. I'm sorry I didn't have a copy here yet, but it's coming to be hot off the presses. Greatly appreciate both Daniel, Kimmage, and the State Department from the Global Engagement Center for giving us an insight on what they're actually doing, and, you know, the important outward-facing part of this, but also which does have domestic importance too, as we share all the best practices. And as Daniel's saying, we can flag things happening internationally that we should be aware of at home, because that was a failing that everybody has pointed out in 2016. And to Tikkanen also from joining us in Helsinki and for giving us, you know, the very important message that sorry, I was also seeing an important message just reminding me that we have to kind of close appropriately here. So we're putting my glasses on to see that. But the very important message, we can't do this alone. that we have to do this in close coordination. And we do have very good lessons from our European partners. We are still members of NATO, even if we're not members of the European Union, but we can all learn from each other as how to deal with these issues of election interference as well as disinformation. So thank you everyone for participating. I really appreciate the way that Eileen brought us back to where General McMaster started us off from as well. Thank you to all the audience members who sent in such great questions, and also on behalf of all of my Brookings colleagues and all the fine work that they're doing as well. As you can see, this was also a shared enterprise with Brookings and Stanford, many other academic institutions to showcase some of the work that our colleagues are all doing on this point. So thank you very much to everyone. I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.